The first plenary meeting of the 32nd special session of the General Assembly is called to order. I declare open the 32nd special session of the General Assembly on challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthen international cooperation. As representatives are aware, the special session is held pursuant to General Assembly Resolutions 73/191 of 17 December 2018 and 74/276 of 1 June 2020, as well as decisions 74/568 of 31st of August 2020 and 75/562 of 16 April 2021. I now invite representatives to stand and observe 1 minute of silent prayer or meditation. Next, I should like, in keeping with the established practice, to invite the attention of the General Assembly to document A/S32/3 concerning Article 19 of the Charter. May I take it that the General Assembly duly takes note of the information contained in this document? It is so decided. In that connection, may I further take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to follow the provisions of Resolution 75/2 of 13 October 2020, by which the Comoros, Sao Tome and Principe, and Somalia are permitted to vote in the General Assembly until the end of its 75th session, and to also allow these member states to vote at the 32nd special session. It is so decided. We shall now proceed with the appointment of the members of the Credentials Committee. Rule 28 of the Rules of Procedure provides that the General Assembly, at the beginning of each session, shall appoint, on the proposal of the President, a Credentials Committee consisting of 9 members. In accordance with precedents, the Credentials Committee of the 32nd Special Session should have the same membership of that of the 75th Regular Session of the Assembly, namely Cameroon, China, Iceland, Papua New Guinea, the Russian Federation, Trinidad and Tobago, the United Republic of Tanzania, the United States of America, and Uruguay. If there is no objection, I shall consider the Credentials Committee constituted accordingly. It is so decided. I now invite the Assembly to proceed to the election of the President of the 32nd Special Session of the General Assembly. In this connection, it has been proposed that the President of the 75th Regular Session, His Excellency Volkan Bozkir of Turkey, be elected by acclamation as President of the 32nd Special Session. May I take it that it is the wish of the Assembly to elect His Excellency Volkan Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, at its 32nd Special Session by acclamation. It is so decided. I extend my sincere congratulations to His Excellency Volkan Bozkir and invite him to assume the presidency. I request the Chief of Protocol to escort the President to the podium.
I will now deliver my opening statement from the rostrum. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to preside over the 32nd United Nations Special Session of the General Assembly on challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthen international cooperation. I extend my appreciation to His Excellency Eric Anderson Machado, Permanent Representative of Peru to the United Nations, for his tireless work throughout the informal consultations on the political declaration. As the treaty body, with primary responsibility for promoting and reviewing the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, the Conference of the States Parties to the Convention plays a central role in improving the capacity of and cooperation among States Parties to achieve the objectives set forth in the Convention. I thank the President and the States Parties for their work, particularly in the lead-up to this special session. I also thank Ms. Ghada Waly, Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and her team for supporting this process. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot pretend that there were no issues before the COVID-19 pandemic. Transnational financial crime and corruption are unfortunately commonplace in our interconnected, interdependent world. Corruption affects many decision-making processes and remains one of the most critical challenges for states, institutions, and communities. The effects of corruption are detrimental to all of society. Corruption corrodes public trust, weakens the role of law, seeds conflict, destabilizes peace-building efforts, undermines the promotion of human rights, impedes progress towards the achievement of gender equality, hinders our ability to achieve the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals, hits the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable people the hardest. We cannot allow corruption to continue, and we will not. It is time to redouble our efforts and build upon the progress we have made thus far. For over 2 decades, Member States have been working to combat corruption through comprehensive commitments such as the adoption of the United Nations Conventions against transnational organized crime and against corruption, the International Conferences on Financing for Development, which resulted in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and the High-Level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity for achieving the 2030 Agenda, the FACTI panel. These recent efforts demonstrate Member States' understanding that in order to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we must end corruption. The UNGASS political declaration builds upon the existing architecture and will provide the international community with a roadmap for the future. It will guide Member States in their work to fight corruption and money laundering, as well as critical efforts to recover assets and prevent illicit financial flows which derail our progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, corruption thrives in a crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has put unprecedented strain on supply chains, infrastructure, and systems around the world. As the number of COVID-19 positive cases increased, governments responded rapidly. These expedited processes undoubtedly saved lives. However, they inadvertently led to gaps in compliance, transparency, oversight, and accountability, which were exploited by the most corrupt actors. This special session comes at a critical moment for humanity, as we work on a complex global vaccine rollout effort. I urge all policymakers to leverage this special session to take concrete measures to prevent and address corruption. Loopholes must be closed and safeguards put in place. We must learn from this experience because the next crisis will come, and we will need to be prepared to meet it when it does. To this end, I invite you to attend the high-level supporting event I'm convening tomorrow, which will focus on addressing corruption in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the international community must continue adapting to new and emerging challenges. This special session is a key moment to galvanize a comprehensive multi-stakeholder response. Non-governmental organizations, civil society, the private sector, youth, and academia all play a significant role in the fight against corruption. I'm delighted that we will have an opportunity to listen to and learn from a multitude of stakeholders during the special session. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will not recover from this global economic downturn without a concerted effort to end corruption. Each member state, and indeed each individual, has a responsibility to be vigilant, to take preventive measures, and to uphold the rule of law without exception. I urge you to make the most of this special session against corruption, and I thank you. In accordance with Rule 70 of the Rules of Procedure of the General Assembly, I now give the floor to the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I'm very pleased to join you for this timely event on strengthening cooperation to prevent and combat corruption. I thank the President of the General Assembly for convening our discussion. We began the decade of action for the Sustainable Development Goals behind on our promise. The global pandemic has set us back further, reversing development progress, dampening economic growth, and exacerbating existing inequalities, from disparities in access to vaccines and medical care to uneven economic recoveries. These inequalities and injustices are further compounded by corruption. This special session acknowledges the need for member states to restore public trust and faith in the social contract by taking concrete action to eliminate corruption. It is also an opportunity to consolidate the gains of multilateralism. In recent years, social protests sparked by anger and distrust have sent a clear message that people will not tolerate impunity and corrupt practices. Business as usual is no longer acceptable. People are demanding transformation of legal, political, economic, and social structures and institutions that have long been indifferent to accountability and transparency. Corruption in public service delivery, including health and education, increases costs, it lowers the quality of service, and distorts the allocation of resources. But more importantly, it costs lives. The vulnerable and marginalized bear the brunt, as bribery makes basic services available to only those able to pay, putting the SDGs even further out of reach. Corruption disproportionately impacts women by limiting access to public resources, information, and decision-making. Corruption is facilitating organized crime and the unsustainable exploitation of natural resources. It enables illicit financial flows and tax havens. As the Secretary General warned last year during the COVID crisis, inadequate oversight and transparency has diverted funds from those most in need and is undermining recovery. Those involved in unveiling corrupt practices risk retaliation and reprisal. Governments, leaders, business people everywhere are under pressure to act responsibly, be held to account, and respect the rule of law. This special session is a great opportunity to correct the course and chart a different path forward, to reflect on what we need to do better individually and collectively to deliver on the promise of the 2030 Agenda, and to advance a transparent, inclusive and accountable approach to governance that will strengthen the social contract between state and people, protect civic space and rebuild trust. Last year, the Secretary-General requested the United Nations system to develop a UN system common position on corruption to coordinate and strengthen our own ability to support member states. The common position sets out measures that will integrate anti-corruption in national, local, and sectoral work more effectively. Excellencies, the draft political declaration to be adopted by this special session comes at a time when expectations are very high. It is a tool to renew our joint action through the UN Convention Against Corruption. It is an opportunity to create more robust systems for transparency and integrity without delay. I encourage you all to lead by example by realizing the commitments that you have made in the draft declaration with the support of the United Nations system. The draft political declaration is a step that should encourage us to go even further, because certainly more needs to be done. Later this year, the Secretary-General will submit his report on our common agenda requested by the General Assembly in its UN 75th anniversary resolution. Corruption has been brought up repeatedly in all consultations, and a robust response is required to build the governance of the future. Together, I believe we can create a better world for current and future generations by pursuing a culture of integrity and respect for the rule of law, ending corruption, and accelerating much-needed progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations for her statement. In accordance with General Assembly Resolution 74/276, I now give the floor to His Excellency Munir Akram, President of the Economic and Social Council and Permanent Representative of Pakistan to the United Nations.
Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkir, distinguished Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to speak at this special session as President of the Economic and Social Council. I feel duty-bound to speak on this issue, not only because of the mandate given by the General Assembly resolution, but also because I am convinced that corruption, which leads to massive outflows of illicit finance from developing countries, is one of the main reasons for their economic underperformance and rising inequalities across the world. Corruption stifles opportunities for the poor and marginalized and condemns them to a life of misery and inequality. Annually, an estimated US $2.6 trillion, 5% of global GDP, is lost to corruption. The developing countries lose US $1.26 trillion, 9 times all official development assistance. The COVID-19 pandemic has further widened the existing inequalities, pushed millions of people into extreme poverty, and resulted in the loss of 250 million jobs. Allowing corruption and illicit financial flows to continue in these circumstances is nothing short of criminal. Immediate and robust national and international action is needed to stop the bleeding of the developing countries. I welcome the declaration to be adopted by this special session. The important tasks from the development perspective are numerous. One, corruption must be addressed on two sides, by the perpetrators and the enablers of corruption. The establishment of a global beneficial ownership registry would help in identifying the perpetrators of corruption. While corruption must be stopped at the national level, it is equally important to impose penalties on the enablers of corruption, lawyers, accountants, and financial entities. Global standards and guidelines must be agreed and imposed to ensure this. Two, the absence of effective mechanisms to secure the return of stolen assets has created a sense of impunity among the corrupt and criminals and led to the parking of over $7 trillion in safe havens. Secrecy jurisdictions and safe havens must be urgently eliminated. Nor should difficulties be created to prevent or delay the return of billions of dollars of stolen assets of developing countries. They must be returned unconditionally and expeditiously. New legal instruments should be agreed to facilitate the obligatory return of stolen assets. Three, I agree with the emerging consensus that there is a need to establish standards for international companies in the extractive industries. This should include interstate agreements which allow for nullification of corporate contracts in the event of corruption, as well as when it is established that the contracts have been concluded on obviously unequal terms. A moratorium should be imposed on all investor-state disputes in which corruption and coercion is clearly visible. A trust fund could be established to support developing countries pursue the often lengthy and complex legal and administrative proceedings for the return of their stolen assets and investor-state dispute litigations. 4. Corruption related to tax fraud, evasion, and avoidance constitutes a major portion of the overall volume of illicit financial flows. The International Monetary Fund estimates that curbing corruption could deliver an additional $1 trillion in tax revenues annually across the world, or 1.2% of global gross domestic product. Money that could well be used by governments to support health, education, and infrastructure. A minimum global corporate tax would be a good first step towards resolving international tax crimes and elimination of tax havens. Today, the institutional environment of international tax cooperation is dominated by voluntary forums, bilateral tax treaties, and only recently multilateral instruments. There is no universal international tax convention to compare with the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. It is therefore urgent that the work of the UN Tax Committee is made completely intergovernmental and negotiations initiated for a global UN tax convention. 5, and last, the endeavor to establish global standards and promote collective action to deal with the menace of corruption and illicit financial flows is impeded by the disparate entities created with narrow mandates, different rules, and restricted representation. I agree with the recommendation of the FACTI panel that it is urgent and important that an inclusive and legitimate global coordination mechanism is established at the United Nations. Excellencies, corruption and other forms of illicit financial flows are systemic problems Combating them requires global efforts. No one country can succeed alone in eliminating corruption and bribery and ensuring financial integrity. International cooperation is indispensable. I hope that the political declaration to be adopted by this special session, together with other reports and analyses, signal the start of such international cooperation and global action. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the President of the Economic and Social Council for his statement. In accordance with General Assembly Resolution 74/276, I now give the floor to His Excellency Harib Saeed Al-Amimi, President of the Conference of the States Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and President of the State Audit Institution of the United Arab Emirates, who will also introduce the report of the Conference of the State Parties on the preparations for the special session contained in document A/S32/2 and A/S32/2/Addendum 1.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to address you today for the first time as President of the 8th session of the Conference of State Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption at this first ever special session of the General Assembly on Corruption, a true milestone in the fight against this global threat. I stand before you humbled by the responsibility that the General Assembly has placed upon the conference, mindful of great challenges around the preparatory process for the draft of the political declaration as stipulated in the General Assembly Resolution 73/191. In my capacity as President of the Conference of the State Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, I am happy to report on the efforts undertaken by the conference in leading the preparatory process for this special session. During the preparatory process, the conference, among the many activities, held 3 intersessional meetings with the participation of a wide range of stakeholders. These international meetings focused on law enforcement, criminalization, international cooperation, asset recovery, beneficial ownership, the role of the private sector on supporting anti-corruption efforts, measures to address impunity, and harnessing the full potential of education and technology in preventing and combating corruption. I would like to emphasize the inclusive nature of the preparatory process. In addition to the contributions by the member states, the conference received 46 contributions from organizations in the United Nations systems, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, academia, and the private sector. The conference addressed all organizational and substantive matter in an open-ended manner and as mandated, produced, and approved by consensus the draft political declaration, which is before the General Assembly today for adoption. I would also like to inform the distinguished gathering that as part of its regular work, the conference, during its 8th session, held in Abu Dhabi from 16th to 20th of December 2019, adopted a record number of 14 resolutions and 1 decision. The resolutions cover a diverse range of areas such as asset recovery, safeguarding sport from corruption, and enhancing the effectiveness of anti-corruption bodies in fighting corruption. In this context, I would like to specifically underline the adoption of Abu Dhabi Declaration on enhancing collaboration between supreme audit institutions and anti-corruption bodies to more effectively prevent and fight corruption. It is my pleasure to inform you in my capacity as President of the Supreme Audit Institution of the United Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates recently committed $5.4 million to support the work of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime on the implementation of the Abu Dhabi Declaration as a global and regional level. Over the next 3 years, Abu Dhabi Declaration Program will strengthen the role of Supreme Audit Institution in preventing and fighting corruption and will promote the collaboration between Supreme Audit Institution and the anti-corruption bodies. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am confident that the plenary meetings planned over the next 3 days will be substantive and productive. I believe that the political declaration to be adopted will give impetus to the renewed global effort in the fight against corruption. I wish all of us fruitful deliberation. Thank you.
I thank the President of the Conference of the States Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption for his statement. In accordance with General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and General Assembly Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Ms. Ghada Waly, Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, bold global action against corruption is needed more than ever, and I thank the President of the General Assembly for this important and timely session. We at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime value the efforts of the Deputy Secretary General, the President of the Economic and Social Council, and the President of the Conference of the State Parties to the UN Convention Against Corruption. I also thank Serena Ibrahim, founder of Youth Against Corruption in Lebanon. Ms. Ibrahim was selected by the President of the General Assembly to represent the Youth Forum organized by UNODC ahead of this session and share the insights from more than 800 young people from around the world. I'm grateful for the firm commitment demonstrated by member states at this first ever General Assembly special session against corruption. The COVID-19 crisis has derailed development progress, while corruption, bribery, and illicit financial flows have stolen away resources when we can least afford it. In every region of the world, corruption has compromised emergency responses, healthcare, education, environmental conservation, and job creation, leaving us less equipped to recover and leaving ever more people behind. Now, as our still fragile societies take steps forward, a more resilient future, we must reject cynical profiteering and exploitation of public trust. We must rebuild with transparency, accountability, and integrity to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We have the opportunity with this special session to strike a better path towards equality, inclusion, and justice. I commend the co-chairs, the ambassadors of the United Arab Emirates and Peru, for leading the inclusive negotiations in Vienna that resulted in a determined consensus and a strong political declaration that we are adopting today. The comprehensive and forward-looking approach of the UNGASS Declaration acknowledges both the pervasive nature of corruption and the need for greater political will and practical action to step up the fight against an enemy that shows little sign of retreating. UNODC is your partner in making more meaningful progress to recover and return stolen assets, to harness innovation and new technology for accountability, and to connect with allies in parliaments, the private sector, academia, media, and civil society, and with youth, women, and all those who have a stake in a level playing field. Through the UNODC strategy and our vision for Africa, we will work with you to strengthen international cooperation, tackle linkages with other forms of crime, and deny safe haven for the corrupt, uniting developed and developing countries through a true sense of shared responsibilities. I welcome the Declaration's recognition of the UN Convention Against Corruption as our universal instrument against this crime, and its emphasis on technical assistance, education, and the need for research and better measurement of corruption and its impact. The Declaration sets out and reaffirms the commitments of Member States and provides the means to achieve them. A decisive new tool in our anti-corruption arsenal is the launch of the Globe Network. UNODC is proud to serve as secretariat to the new network, which will link up corruption law enforcement authorities to pursue more agile cross-border cooperation and proactive information sharing to bring the corrupt to justice. Determined action will be further advanced in December at the 9th session of the Conference of the State Parties in Egypt, which will decide on the steps needed to follow up on the political declaration. From this General Assembly special session to Sharm el-Sheikh, we have the opportunity to reinvigorate and innovate, to strengthen good governance and the rule of law so we can tackle present problems and equip future generations to meet the challenges to come. I hope that 2021 will be remembered as a turning point in a time of greatest need, when Member States, the UN, and all our partners rose together against corruption to restore trust and generate real change for a fairer world. UNODC is here to support you. Thank you.
I thank the Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. In accordance with General Assembly Resolution 74/276 and Decision 75/562, I now introduce the pre-recorded statement of Ms. Serena Ibrahim, founder of Youth Against Corruption, who will present the outcome of the discussions of the Youth Forum organized by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime from 24 to 26th of May 2021.
Deputy Secretary General, Presidents of the General Assembly, ECOSOC, and the Conference of the State Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, Executive Director of UNODC, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Serena Ibrahim, a girl born in a world where systemic corruption is a constant threat to my generation's liberty and well-being, a world in which corruption has hampered the dreams and aspirations of youth living in countries vulnerable to corruption, a world which has forced some to put their integrity for sale in order to survive. This is what drives me to wake up every morning with a purpose to work for a future in which transparency, integrity, and accountability are the norms. With the talents of a wonderful community of youth, I succeeded in founding YAC, Youth Against Corruption, in 2018, because it was time to act on behalf of youth who are heavily affected by corruption globally. Today, I'm extremely honored to speak on behalf of the 100 youth from 93 nationalities and 93 civil society organizations around the world who took part in the 2021 UNGASS Youth Forum organized by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and held virtually from 24 to 26 May. We came together to discuss the devastating effects of corruption on the young generations, global youth engagement in preventing and combating corruption, and to identify the recommendations we as youth have for your discussions over the coming days. We call upon you, our world leaders, to prioritize the fight against corruption and ensure that citizens' well-being and equal access to basic services are top priorities in your national agendas, strategies, and visions. So we urge you to take into consideration our 10 key requests. First, make education on integrity and anti-corruption a priority in national agendas. Courses on values, integrity, and anti-corruption should be integrated into all national school and university curriculums. We need more investment in informal education for anti-corruption awareness to reach the biggest number of youth possible in all nations. Education is the first building block of the solution. Second, allow us to contribute to anti-corruption policies. So often we hear that youth are the future, but all of us in this General Assembly know very well that the future of youth relies on you. We recognize that the fight against corruption is an intergenerational fight that cannot be won unless it is led globally and fought locally. it is also a tough fight that requires a lot of determination and energy. We, the youth, have all these qualities and stand ready to support you in designing, implementing, and monitoring national anti-corruption projects. Third, invest more in innovative anti-corruption solutions. Traditional ways of fighting corruption have proven to no longer be efficient on their own. Leveraging emerging and innovative technologies can bring more efficiency in disrupting and preventing corruption locally and across borders. Utilizing new technologies will also add more legitimacy to young people's involvement in combating corruption. Fourth, create and implement laws and policies that ensure a safe environment for youth to contribute to the future of their nations. This is essential to allow youth to act as whistleblowers, watchdogs, and national monitors. Youth must be encouraged to speak up without any fear of retaliation. Instead, their efforts should be complemented, recognized, and protected. Fifth, create local, regional, and global youth agencies to enhance collaboration among youth with similar values and aspirations. Create space and time for youth to share experiences, exchange knowledge, conduct advocacy campaigns, and develop anti-corruption roadmaps on all levels. 6. Ensure judicial independence and effective separation of power. Checks and balances are a crucial component of a corruption-free nation. 7. Strengthen transparency, accountability mechanisms in healthcare procurement. This is especially important when dealing with COVID-19 vaccines and medical equipment. 8. Guarantee media independence and strengthen collaboration with civil society. Forming collective action initiative can add considerable value to the fight against corruption. 9. Strengthen and restore the trust between youth and their governmental representatives. One of the signs of a healthy and happy nation is having citizens who have trust in their elected officials. Unfortunately, trust has been broken in many places, and consistent efforts are needed to restore this trust. Therefore, we urge you to lead by example by holding your governments and yourselves to the highest standards of integrity, transparency, and accountability. Today, there is no more time for business as usual. So finally, we call for serious commitment to the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development and to the effective, comprehensive, and not mere technical implementation of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, as well as other relevant mechanisms. We also call for more transparency in the UNGASS implementation review mechanisms. Pushing for full country report reviews is crucial to allow civil society and youth to hold their governments accountable to the commitments made. Your Excellency, let today be the start of the biggest global intergenerational collaboration in history to put an end to the devastating effects of corruption on our nations. Today, more than ever, we need a new discourse, a new narrative to the global fight against corruption, a serious commitment to creating a future that has zero tolerance for corruption. Let us work together, locally and globally, to strengthen and rebuild trust of citizens between them and their representatives, and create a future that protects the dreams and aspirations of youth and gives them a safe place to harness their talents and capabilities for a more sustainable and fair world.
I thank Ms. Serena Ibrahim for her statement. I'd like to also thank the Deputy Secretary General for taking the time to be with us this morning. She has to leave now for another engagement. Thank you. The Assembly will now turn to the organization of the 32nd Special Session of the General Assembly. In order to expedite the work of the 32nd Special Session and in accordance with precedents, it is proposed that the Vice Presidents of the 32nd Special Session shall be the same as those of the 75th Regular Session of the General Assembly. There being no objection, it is so decided. Likewise, it is proposed that the chairpersons of the main committees of the 75th Regular Session shall serve in the same capacity at the 32nd Special Session. There being no objection, it is so decided. The General Committee of the 32nd Special Session of the General Assembly is thus fully constituted. We now turn to the adoption of the agenda. The provisional agenda of the 32nd Special Session of the General Assembly is contained in document A/S32/1. In order to expedite its work, the Assembly may wish to consider the provisional agenda directly in plenary meeting without referring it to the General Committee. May I take it that the General Assembly agrees to this procedure? It is so decided. May I take it that the Assembly wishes to adopt the provisional agenda as it appears in document A/S32/1? It is so decided. I should like to draw the attention of delegations to a matter concerning the participation of the Holy See and the State of Palestine in their capacities as observer states in the work of the General Assembly. The Holy See will participate as an observer in the work of the 32nd Special Session in accordance with Assembly Resolution 58/314 of 1st of July 2004, with no further need for a precursory explanation prior to their intervention. The State of Palestine will participate as an observer in the work of the 32nd Special Session in accordance with Assembly Resolutions 3237 of the 29th session of 22 November 1974, 43/177 of 15th of December 1988, 52/250 of 7th of July 1998, and 67/19 of 29th of November 2012, with no further need for a precursory explanation prior to their intervention. In accordance with Resolution 65/276 of 3rd of May 2011 and the note by the Secretary General contained in document A/65/856, the European Union will participate as an observer in the work of the 32nd Special Session with no further need for a precursory explanation prior to their interventions. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 6. The Assembly will now turn to Agenda Item 8, entitled Adoption of the Political Declaration. In connection with this item, the Assembly has before it a draft resolution entitled Our Common Commitment to Effectively Addressing Challenges and Implementing Measures to Prevent and Combat Corruption and Strengthen International Cooperation, issued as document A/S32/L1. The Assembly will now proceed to consider draft resolution A/S32/L1. No. Yeah. The Assembly shall now take a decision on draft resolution A/S32/L1, entitled Our Common Commitment to Effectively Addressing Challenges and Implementing Measures to Prevent and Combat Corruption and Strengthen International Cooperation. May I take it that the Assembly decides to adopt the draft resolution without a vote? It is so decided. May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 8? It is so decided. Before proceeding further, I would like to inform members that the General Assembly will consider Sub-Item B of Agenda Item 3, entitled Report of the Credentials Committee, to consider the credentials of representatives to the 32nd Special Session before the adjournment of the meeting this morning. The Assembly will begin its consideration of Agenda Item 7, entitled General Debate. As members are aware, the General Assembly in its decision 75/562 decided that member states and the Regional Economic Integration Organizations parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and observers to the General Assembly in line with paragraph 2C of its resolution 74/276, may submit a pre-recorded statement by the head of state or government, head of delegation or other dignitary, which will be played in the General Assembly Hall during the special session after introduction by their representative who is physically present in the Assembly Hall. In this regard, I would like to address important organizational matters pertaining to the conduct of the plenary meeting. Introduction of the pre-recorded statements will be made by the representatives from their national seats. Due to time constraints, it's expected that the introductory remarks will be kept concise. Statements delivered by the high-level representatives who are physically present in the Assembly Hall can be made from the national seats or the rostrum. As set out in the resolution 74/276, statements in the general debate will be limited to 5 minutes for individual delegations and 7 minutes for statements made on behalf of a group of states. In the case of pre-recorded statements, introductory remarks and length of the video itself shall be counted in the allocated time limit. In accordance with Decision 75/562, in addition to the verbatim records of the special session, the President of the General Assembly will circulate as a document of the Assembly a compilation document of the statements delivered by means of pre-recorded statements during the special session and submitted to the President no later than the day on which the pre-recorded statement is played in the Assembly Hall, and that such pre-recorded statements will be attached to the verbatim records of the special session. Submissions in this regard should be made to statements@un.org. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru to introduce an address by the head of state.
Gracias, señor presidente. Tengo el honor de presentar la intervención pregrabada de Su Excelencia Francisco Sagasti Hausler, presidente de la República del Perú, en esta sesión especial de la Asamblea General sobre desafíos y medidas para prevenir y combatir la corrupción y fortalecer la cooperación internacional. Gracias.
Señor Presidente de la Asamblea General, Volkan Bozkir, Señor Secretario General, Antonio Guterres, Excelencias, señoras y señores. La corrupción ha adquirido un carácter transnacional que afecta a la gobernabilidad democrática, distorsiona los mercados, envilece a la sociedad y disminuye la confianza en las instituciones. Todo esto obstaculiza el desarrollo sostenible de todos los países y el disfrute de los derechos humanos de los ciudadanos y ciudadanas, y especialmente de los más pobres y vulnerables. Según el Banco Mundial, las empresas y personas cada año pagan alrededor del mundo más de $1.000 millones por sobornos. El Foro Económico Mundial ha estimado que la corrupción alcanza al 5% del Producto Bruto Interno Global. El Fondo Monetario Internacional llama la atención sobre el impacto que, para el desarrollo sostenible, tendría la recuperación de los $1.000 millones de ingresos fiscales que anualmente se pierden por la corrupción. La prevención y la lucha contra la corrupción son, por tanto, una necesidad global y un deber ético. Son también políticas de Estado prioritarias para el Perú, tanto en el plano nacional como en su política exterior. Por estas razones, hemos impulsado, junto con la República Hermana de Colombia, la convocatoria a este periodo extraordinario de sesiones de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas, dedicada a la lucha contra la corrupción. Tuvimos el honor de cofacilitar las negociaciones de la declaración política que acabamos de aprobar. Y agradecemos a todos ustedes por su cooperación y el apoyo. A la luz de nuestra propia experiencia en la lucha contra la corrupción, consideramos a esta iniciativa imprescindible. Hace casi 18 años se adoptó la Convención de las Naciones Unidas contra la Corrupción, instrumento que plasmó en la agenda global acciones vinculantes para la cooperación y para la lucha contra este flagelo. Esta convención introdujo principios, normas, compromisos y un mecanismo de seguimiento que nos permitirá importantes avances para reforzar los sistemas jurídicos nacionales. No obstante, la evolución de la corrupción ha hecho necesario diseñar medidas adicionales y complementarias. El Perú ha multiplicado esfuerzos en esta dirección, entre ellos el compromiso de Lima para la gobernabilidad democrática, adoptada en la 8ª Cumbre de las Américas en 2018, que cuenta con 57 mandatos para fortalecer la lucha contra la corrupción en este hemisferio, así como un mecanismo de seguimiento e implementación. Sin embargo, a pesar de los múltiples esfuerzos internacionales, la corrupción continúa ampliando su dimensión y cuantía, adaptándose a la globalización y a las circunstancias, creciendo en secreto, aprovechándose de la necesidad de algunos y nutriéndose de la falta de escrúpulos y de valores. Así, nuestra región, América Latina, ha registrado en los últimos años graves y sofisticados actos de corrupción de carácter transnacional que han involucrado a empresarios, personas jurídicas, funcionarios públicos nacionales e internacionales de diversos niveles. Más aún, las medidas excepcionales que estamos tomando para enfrentar la pandemia nos han llevado a facilitar el gasto público, lo que ha generado nuevas oportunidades para el soborno y la especulación y requieren una vigilancia constante. Estamos convencidos de que las iniciativas nacionales no bastan. Se requiere más bien de una respuesta multilateral renovada, concertada, cooperativa y orientada hacia la acción. Eso es precisamente lo que nuestra declaración política de hoy, que es un logro significativo y que se enfoca a la consecución de la meta de 16.5 de la Agenda 2030, que es, y paso a citar, reducir constantemente y considerablemente la corrupción y el soborno en todas sus formas. Cierro la cita. Alentamos a los estados de la Convención a aportar las acciones y adoptar las medidas necesarias para el seguimiento e implementación de los compromisos que estamos adquiriendo en esta declaración política. En particular, hago un llamado a trabajar juntos para identificar vacíos y desafíos en la Convención y en su implementación, con miras a perfeccionar continuamente este instrumento y lograr una más eficaz aplicación de sus medidas y lograr sus objetivos. Es hoy evidente que existen situaciones no contempladas en la Convención que van a requerir de un compromiso para fortalecer y hacer más efectiva la lucha contra la corrupción internacional y en todos sus niveles. Reafirmo una vez más, señor presidente, el compromiso permanente del Perú con la lucha contra la corrupción, con el cumplimiento de sus obligaciones en el marco de la Convención, así como la firme voluntad de continuar trabajando con todos los estados parte de este convenio en la lucha contra este flagelo. Muchas gracias.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Peru for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Honduras to introduce an address by the head of state.
Señor Presidente, Excelencias, distinguidos delegados, tengo el alto honor de presentar al Presidente de la República de Honduras, abogado Juan Orlando Hernández.
Saludos cordiales a todos. Comienzo diciéndoles a todos que Honduras es un país hostil para la corrupción, para el narcotráfico, crimen organizado y tráfico de personas. No ha sido fácil. Durante años hemos tenido que luchar férreamente contra quienes querían mantener el status quo y que Honduras siguiera siendo un paraíso para sus actos criminales. Con la aprobación de la declaración UNGASS2021, seguiremos fortaleciendo nuestra lucha contra la corrupción en todas sus formas y en todos sus niveles. Hace apenas 10 años era impensable que los señalados de corrupción tocaran siquiera un segundo un tribunal de justicia, no digamos una prisión. Al asumir la presidencia, fue claro al advertir que a los criminales se les acabó la fiesta y que íbamos a perseguir la corrupción donde se encontrara. A todos los hondureños les dije, dentro de la ley, todo, fuera de la ley, nada. La frase "caiga quien caiga" marcó mi mensaje para todos en el inicio de mi cruzada contra la corrupción. En el año 2016 construimos junto a la OEA la misión de apoyo contra la corrupción en Honduras, MASI, y finalizó su periodo en el 2020. Y para continuar con el fortalecimiento de la transparencia, el 21 de enero del 2021 oficializamos la apertura de la Oficina de Naciones Unidas contra la Droga y el Crimen como una prueba inequívoca de nuestra lucha por una mejor Honduras. Hoy seguimos construyendo un sistema nacional anticorrupción y lucha por la transparencia, a través de un impulso fuerte, sólido, eminentemente técnico. Además, trabajamos en absoluta coordinación con las instituciones encargadas del combate a la corrupción, es decir, Ministerio Público y Poder Judicial. Señoras y señores, quiero reiterar el compromiso de mi gobierno a favor de la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas, con acciones puntuales que ya se están dando a conocer en la vida diaria de los hondureños. Ejemplo, creación de la Secretaría de Estado en los despachos de transparencia, como parte del gabinete de gobierno, al más alto nivel. Rendición de cuentas en el marco de los mecanismos de Naciones Unidas, la Organización de Estados Americanos y el mecanismo de seguimiento de la implementación de la Convención Interamericana contra la Corrupción, MESI-SIC. La adhesión a iniciativas internacionales en fomento de la transparencia y lucha contra la corrupción, como ser la iniciativa de la Alianza para el Gobierno Abierto, la iniciativa de transparencia para el sector construcción, COST, y la iniciativa para la transparencia en las industrias extractivas. La creación de la Política Nacional de Transparencia, Integridad y Prevención de la Corrupción, documento que ha sido creado en conjunto con las diferentes esferas sociales del país. La suscripción de la declaración para consolidar a Honduras en un Estado abierto. También la creación de la Mesa Interagencial de Transparencia y Anticorrupción, MITA. La formulación e implementación de 4 planes de acción de gobierno abierto. La suscripción de la Carta Internacional de Datos Abiertos y la creación de la Política Nacional y Portal de Datos Abiertos. Trabajo conjunto contra la corrupción con organismos multilaterales como el Fondo Monetario Internacional, Banco Mundial, Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo. Además, Honduras es miembro de la Alianza del Estado Abierto. En materia fiscal, Honduras se sumó a la iniciativa global para la transparencia fiscal GIFT. Se adopta también el Código de Buenas Prácticas de Transparencia Fiscal del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Honduras inició el proceso de incorporación al Foro Global de OCDE en el mes de enero del 2019. Una forma brutal de corrupción es el crimen organizado, por el que Honduras tanto ha sufrido. Estas son redes transnacionales con representantes locales del crimen que buscan suplantar a los estados mediante el uso del terror, del miedo. Lo han tratado de hacer en mi país, en Honduras, y sé que también en sus países. Nuestro gobierno tomó decisiones que nadie quiso tomar antes, porque estaba de por medio arriesgar la vida. Prueba de ello es que al menos se ha documentado la planificación de 4 intentos de asesinatos en mi contra. Estos criminales y asesinos confesos que han sido extraditados a Estados Unidos o a otros países, o que salieron huyendo de Honduras por políticas nuestras de persecución, pretenden en las cortes de Estados Unidos usar una llave mágica con el fin de vengarse de las personas e instituciones que iniciamos esta lucha sin precedentes. Buscan reducir sus penas, buscan que se les regresen sus bienes, buscan que se les proteja a sus familias y quedarse viviendo en ese país a cambio de brindar en las cortes falsos testimonios, sin respaldo. Hagámonos una pregunta: ¿qué presidente, qué instituciones estarían dispuestos a arriesgarlo todo en una lucha de esa magnitud si la simple palabra de un criminal confeso, sin ningún sustento, vale más que los hechos contundentes que ahora reflejan el éxito de una lucha de años y en conjunto en contra del flagelo del narcotráfico y de la criminalidad organizada? ¿Quién más se va a atrever a hacerlo de nuevo? ¿Qué pasaría si esto pasa en otros países del hemisferio y del mundo? El riesgo es que si dejan que esta situación perversa continúe en la Oficina de Terrorismo y la Unidad Internacional Antinarcóticos del Distrito Sur de Nueva York de esta manera, tan alejada de la realidad, que cualquier socio de Estados Unidos perderá confianza. Entonces, a nivel hemisférico, creo que todo el sistema de cooperación comenzará a colapsar silenciosamente. Llegó el momento en que toda la comunidad internacional se debe unir para condenar y poner límites a los actores no estatales como son las maras y pandillas, crimen organizado y narcotráfico como uno de los principales responsables de las violaciones de los derechos humanos a nivel mundial. Reitero lo que dije al inicio: con la aprobación de la declaración de UNGASS 2021 seguiremos fortaleciendo nuestra lucha contra la corrupción en todas sus formas y en todos sus niveles, y una cultura por la transparencia. Muchas gracias a todos y todas.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Honduras for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala to introduce an address by the head of state.
Señor presidente, tengo el honor de introducir la intervención del presidente de la República de Guatemala, el señor Alejandro Eduardo Yamatei Falla, en esta Asamblea General sobre los desafíos y medidas para prevenir la corrupción y luchar contra ella, reforzando la cooperación internacional.
Muy buen día a todos. Felicito al presidente de la Asamblea General, Volkan, Bozkir, por convocar este periodo extraordinario de sesiones de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas sobre desafíos y medidas para prevenir y combatir la corrupción. Me complace participar en esta sesión, no solo por la relevancia del tema que nos convoca, sino también para reafirmar nuestro compromiso de redoblar los esfuerzos en la lucha contra la corrupción y reconocer la importancia del multilateralismo para abordar este fenómeno desde una perspectiva transnacional. Señor presidente, el combate de la corrupción requiere de hecho mucho más que un discurso. Desde el inicio de mi gobierno he repetido con palabras y he demostrado con hechos mi firme convicción por promover la transparencia y la calidad del gasto público y la lucha contra la corrupción como ejes prioritarios de gobierno. Con el firme propósito de prevenir acciones y afrontar el fenómeno de la corrupción, que constituye una de las mayores amenazas para el desarrollo integral y educativo de los estados, desde el primer día de mi gestión, al tomar posesión del cargo, suscribimos el Convenio de Cooperación Interinstitucional Anticorrupción entre el organismo ejecutivo, todos sus ministerios, el Ministerio Público, la Procuraduría General de la Nación, la Contraloría de Cuentas, la Superintendencia de Administración Tributaria y la Superintendencia de Bancos. Asimismo, conjuntamente con mi gabinete, creamos la Comisión Presidencial contra la Corrupción, entidad que ha sido instruida para que en el marco de sus atribuciones actúe con la más absoluta de la imparcialidad a efecto de que los servidores públicos cumplamos con las obligaciones, transparencia y sobre todo con la rendición de cuentas. Esta comisión ha presentado ya 14 denuncias relacionadas con actos de corrupción, de manera que sean puestas a disposición de los tribunales de justicia. La transparencia en las entidades públicas, la igualdad ante la ley y el respeto a la misma, se han obtenido logros en la investigación administrativa de distintas alertas de corrupción que nos vienen de las propias personas, lo cual ha sido evidenciado en la promoción de estas denuncias ante el Ministerio. Estamos realizando esfuerzos por implementar un gobierno abierto y electrónico a través de la existencia de mecanismos de transparencia y anticorrupción, proveyendo a los ciudadanos herramientas necesarias para que ejerza una auditoría social efectiva. Hemos suscrito con el organismo judicial, municipalidades y algunas instituciones de carácter tributario y rendición de cuentas el convenio de cooperación para la buena gobernanza que nos permite impulsar acciones y promover la transparencia, la rendición de cuentas, pero sobre todo prevenir la corrupción y la impunidad de esos hechos. Por su parte, el Ministerio Público también ha priorizado la lucha contra la corrupción y la impunidad, cumpliendo con el compromiso de crear una Secretaría contra la Corrupción manifestada durante la 8ª Conferencia de Estados, parte de la UNICAC, celebrada en el 2019 en Abu Dhabi. Este es un esfuerzo que se suma al fortalecimiento de la Fiscalía contra la Corrupción y la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad, así como la creación de la Fiscalía Transnacional, la Fiscalía contra el Lavado de Dinero y otros activos, la Fiscalía de Extinción de Dominio y la Política Criminal, de manera que podamos enfrentar un crimen transnacional, haciendo el llamado, señor presidente, a que lo enfrentemos transnacionalmente. Guatemala tiene enormes retos en relación a la lucha contra la corrupción, pero tenemos la firme voluntad de construir un Estado transparente, democrático, basado en el Estado de Derecho. Reconocemos el esfuerzo invaluable de los Estados en favor de una cultura global de rendición de cuentas, transparencia, legalidad, integridad, pero sobre todo de justicia. Por ello, la importancia de este periodo extraordinario de sesiones de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas sobre desafíos, medidas para prevenir y combatir la corrupción. Estamos seguros de que esta reunión nos permitirá alcanzar un debate fructífero, integral, sobre el gran flagelo de la corrupción, promoviendo una mayor cooperación internacional que tienda a implementar de manera óptima la disposición de la Convención de las Naciones Unidas contra la Corrupción a favor del desarrollo de las naciones. Guatemala no se detiene. Y en medio de la pandemia, en medio de la lucha por buscar vacunas, en medio del acaparamiento de unos pocos, de la mayoría de las vacunas, luchando por tratar de preservar la vida en nuestro país, no perdemos la fe que este foro también contribuya a hacer una declaración que nos permita a los países menos privilegiados tener acceso a esa vacuna que haría posible que podamos no solo tener proyectos de desarrollo en el largo plazo, sino que también podamos generar una nueva actitud que vaya acorde a la lucha contra la corrupción, pero que también, cuando hablamos de justicia, hablemos de la justicia social que debe imperar en el mundo, de manera que los menos favorecidos tengan igualdad de oportunidades ante la vida. Muchísimas gracias.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Guatemala for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Dr. Emmerson Dambudzo Mnangagwa, the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe. I thank you.
Your Excellency, President of the Special Session Against Corruption, Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, let me start by congratulating you on your election to preside over this special session. Allow me to thank the President of the General Assembly for organizing this event, which affords us time to assess progress made in the fight against corruption and to identify measures to further enhance global cooperation in confronting this scourge. As a state party to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and a member of various regional conventions and protocols on corruption, Zimbabwe is fully aware that the eradication of corruption is one of the key preconditions for achieving sustainable economic growth and prosperity. The Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and the National Prosecuting Authority are both now fully operational, while an Anti-Money Laundering Act is now in force. The implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy for the period 2020 to 2024 is in full swing. This strategy seeks to strengthen the structures for deterrence, detection, adherence, and enforcement of the integrity management obligations across sectors. It further protects whistleblowers and the victims of corruption. In addition, Zimbabwe has established specialized courts for handling corruption and economic crimes throughout the country. To augment these efforts, my administration set up a special anti-corruption unit to assist the Anti-Corruption Commission in the prosecution of high-profile cases. Under the Asset Recovery Strategy, the Asset Recovery Unit traces and recovers assets both within and outside our borders. My country continues to deploy ICTs to enhance efficiencies and reduce human interference in service delivery, which should also help combat corruption. My administration is reorienting all sectors of the economy, including the public, private, and the non-governmental institutions, towards the culture of honesty, accountability, and transparency. The role of the media and other partnerships in exposing corruption remains welcome and crucial in the fight against corruption. My country is thus putting in place appropriate legislative and institutional arrangements to facilitate greater cooperation from other state parties in the event of requests for mutual legal assistance, extradition, and the return of stolen assets. Areas such as joint investigations, skills enhancement, and asset recovery, among others, with countries in our region, remain a priority. Finally, Mr. President, I'm encouraged that the political declaration to be adopted at the end of this special session of the General Assembly is elaborate on the need to stop the increasing levels of illicit financial flows, including from Africa, estimated to be over US 80 billion per year. We also welcome the declaration's increased focus on the recovery and the return of confiscated assets. In this regard, let me add that the fight against illicit financial flows cannot be won without full cooperation between both the source and receiving states of these illicit finances. I wish you a successful session. I thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia to introduce an address by the head of state.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Tengo el honor de introducir la intervención pregrabada del señor presidente de la República de Colombia, Su Excelencia Iván Duque Márquez. En el día de hoy reiteramos el compromiso indeclinable de mi país en la lucha contra la corrupción. Muchas gracias.
Les envío un saludo especial al presidente de la Asamblea General de la Organización de Naciones Unidas, Volkan Bozkir, y al secretario general de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas, nuestro buen amigo Antonio Guterres. Igualmente, un saludo afectuoso para todos los participantes en esta sesión especial de la Asamblea General contra la Corrupción 2021. La corrupción es uno de los principales y más perversos impedimentos para afianzar la democracia, el Estado de Derecho y el desarrollo sostenible, pues erosiona los fundamentos del contrato social entre el Estado y los ciudadanos. Las estimaciones sobre las pérdidas económicas a causa de la corrupción son múltiples y además son alarmantes. Su costo es equivalente al 5% del Producto Interno Bruto mundial. Según el Banco Mundial, las empresas y las personas naturales pagan más de $1 billón en sobornos cada año internacionalmente. De acuerdo con Transparencia Internacional, anualmente se pierden en el mundo $500.000 millones por este cáncer que afecta a todos los países. Por otra parte, es evidente que sus efectos corrosivos son más preocupantes en las áreas que son vitales para la población. Por ejemplo, la pandemia ha mostrado el impacto devastador de las prácticas corruptas en el sistema de salud en varios países, pues ha afectado la capacidad de respuesta y ha impedido prestar atención médica de calidad. Para Colombia, la prevención y la lucha contra este fenómeno es un imperativo moral y ético, y es una de las prioridades de nuestra política interna y también de nuestra política exterior. El narcotráfico, la trata de personas y de armas, entre otros delitos que combatimos sin descanso, son al mismo tiempo alimento para la corrupción y el combustible del deterioro del tejido humano en todas las sociedades del mundo. Por esta razón, nos hemos esforzado para aumentar la atención en contra de este delito en todos los escenarios y en especial aquí, en Naciones Unidas. En 2018, junto con el Gobierno del Perú, impulsamos la resolución que convocó esta sesión especial de la Asamblea General, convencidos de la necesidad de fortalecer el compromiso político de alto nivel en contra de la corrupción. Es el momento para sacar el mayor provecho de las herramientas con las que contamos, como la Convención de Naciones Unidas contra la Corrupción, de alentar un debate inclusivo y constructivo sobre las fortalezas, debilidades y potencialidades del actual andamiaje institucional y normativo internacional. En este propósito, nos anima el interés de identificar, entre todos, políticas e instrumentos concretos con los que nos podamos dotar para prevenir y luchar de manera más efectiva contra todas sus dimensiones. Es por ello que hoy, con la adopción de la declaración política de esta sesión especial de la Asamblea General, vemos con satisfacción que la comunidad internacional respondió unida a este llamado. La declaración potencia los compromisos adquiridos y nos brinda herramientas en cuestiones claves como los procesos de recuperación de activos, los registros de beneficiario final, los flujos financieros lícitos, entre otros, y por supuesto, diferenciar entre los flujos lícitos aquellos que puedan estar vinculados de manera subrepticia a actividades criminales. En diciembre de este año tendrá lugar la 9ª conferencia de las partes de la Convención y en ese marco debemos empezar a materializar en resultados concretos los acuerdos alcanzados. Es fundamental establecer un entorno que habilite la colaboración activa de los diferentes actores, así como el ejercicio de sus labores en absoluta garantía de derechos. Quiero destacar que en cerca de 3 años de gobierno hemos logrado avanzar de manera significativa a nivel nacional. Al inicio de nuestro gobierno, convocamos a todos los partidos políticos a trabajar juntos contra este flagelo. Como resultado de esa convocatoria, Colombia ha aprobado iniciativas para eliminar la detención domiciliaria de corruptos, así como para hacer obligatoria la publicación de las declaraciones de ingresos y bienes de los altos funcionarios del Estado. Hemos fortalecido la rendición de cuentas del Estado, la publicación de cualquier tipo de conflicto de intereses por parte de funcionarios públicos, la definición de especificaciones estándar para contratos públicos, entre otros. Además, en octubre pasado, presentamos ante el Congreso un proyecto de ley contra la corrupción a fin de avanzar en la construcción de una cultura de legalidad, integridad y uso eficiente de los recursos públicos, que además nos permita levantar velos corporativos y sancionar a empresas que están propiciando estas prácticas. Señor presidente y señores jefes de delegación, Colombia hace un llamado a la comunidad internacional para redoblar esfuerzos y emplear la declaración política como una brújula que nos permita navegar durante los próximos años. Aprovechemos la oportunidad que nos brinda esta sesión especial y tomemos acciones decisivas en contra del flagelo que es la corrupción, que tanto daño hace a nivel mundial. Hacerlo es una obligación moral con nuestras naciones y con las generaciones presentes y futuras. Es momento de seguir actuando con determinación, vencer la corrupción, derrotarla y afianzar la transparencia es un compromiso indeclinable. Muchas gracias.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Colombia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sierra Leone to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I have the singular honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Brigadier Retired Dr. Julius Madabio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. I thank you.
Your Excellency, Mr. Volkan, Bozkir, President of the General Assembly, colleagues, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I commend you, Mr. President, for organizing today's special session on the challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption. Sierra Leone fully supports the political declaration we have adopted today. I hope that our collective effort will lead to a significant reduction in corruption globally. With strong commitment and political will, Sierra Leone has made tremendous progress in the fight against corruption. Since 2018, Sierra Leone has moved up 12 places in Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. According to the Afrobarometer, corruption prevalence has reduced from 70% before 2018 to 40% in 2020. Since 2018 also, Sierra Leone has consistently passed the Control of Corruption indicator in the Millennium Challenge Corporation scorecard, and Sierra Leone has been selected to develop a compact. With conviction rates of over 90%, the Anti-Corruption Commission has also recovered billions of leones in non-conviction assets-based recoveries, higher in the last 3 years than at any time in the 18-year existence of the Commission. To achieve this, my government has adopted progressive laws and institutional reforms. The reviewed anti-corruption law increases minimum punishment for major corruption offenses, protects whistleblowers, shifts evidential burden for offenses involving offering or receiving an advantage, and allows the Commission to appeal against sentences that are deemed lenient or disproportionate. Sierra Leone has acceded to UNCAC and developed a comprehensive national anti-corruption strategy with pillars that strengthen the anti-corruption regime, implement actions for preventing and controlling corruption, and establishing legally enforceable mandatory minimum standards, among others. We have undertaken deep structural and process reforms of the public sector institutions. The digitalization of procurement, recording, and accountability processes have reduced red tape and made it easy to review the entire paper and money trail. We have also constituted a broader accountability platform to take high-level strategic decisions, share information, and implement and institutionalize actions to fight corruption. This coordinating body comprises the Office of the Vice President, the Chief Justice, and other key national stakeholders. Our reforms align with international best practices, are holistic, but are agile and progressive. They are driven by our belief as a nation that the fight against corruption is good for governance, good for peace, good for business, and good for inclusive national development. Sierra Leone therefore stands ready to collaborate with member states and international institutions to tackle the scourge of corruption for the benefit of our peoples. Thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kenya to introduce an address by the head of state.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your Excellencies and distinguished delegates, it is my distinct honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency President Uhuru Kenyatta during this special session of the General Assembly. I thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at the onset, let me commend the United Nations General Assembly for convening this special session and elevating this conversation to the forefront of the global agenda, especially this year, in a most unique and impactful manner. The corruption scourge, recognized by our predecessors some 18 years ago, when adopting the UN Convention Against Corruption, remains as endemic today as it was then. The Kenyan journey in the fight against corruption has been arduous. It has been a battle of courage and at the same time disenchantment, a battle of hope, and finally, I believe, triumph, especially for those who remained true to the cause and who are unwavering soldiers in the garrison and who are practical at every point up to final execution. Kenya has witnessed an upsurge in investigations, in prosecutions, but also in convictions for corruption and related offenses. Assets worth millions of shillings have been frozen and are in the process of or having been recovered. Whistleblowers, oversight agencies, media, and other upstanding citizens can report and publicize cases of corruption. This, I believe, is a testament to the positive and open governance space that now prevails in our country. As a principal strategy, Kenya adopted a multi-agency approach for fighting these crimes by establishing a multi-agency team on corruption and organized crime. Kenya has also recognized the importance of nurturing values of ethics and integrity in our children at a tender age. In a strategy that I believe will result in the development of a citizenry of integrity and honor, through our revised competency-based curriculum, our school-going children are now learning patriotism, honesty, respect, diligence, and hard work as part of their school curricula. In addition to the normal, basic numeracy and literacy skills. Of critical importance, Your Excellencies, is the place of international cooperation. The framework for the return of assets from corruption and crime in Kenya, for example, illustrates how foreign parties can come together to agree on good practices for the return of stolen assets and their use to advance sustainable development and benefit citizens. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as a member state of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, we commit to implement our treaty obligations for purposes of strengthening systems of governance, service delivery, and raising the bar on integrity and ethical behavior. The full benefits may not be discernible in our tenures, and we may suffer low conviction rates, delays, and disruptions through the judicial system. This is to be expected. When the tide is rough, it is our time to continue and to be courageous. We must not become impatient and hasty. We must not falter in our resolve. Our good governance interventions will, I believe, in good time, yield the full results of our labor, and I am confident that the optimistic start that we have achieved will ensure that we all deliver on our promise. I thank you all for your kind attention.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Kenya for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liberia to introduce an address by the head of state.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Dr. George Manneh Weah, President of the Republic of Liberia. I thank you.
Distinguished heads of state and government, His Excellency Mr. Volkan Bozkir, President of the United Nations General Assembly, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to participate in this special session of the United Nations General Assembly, which is being virtually convened to discuss challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and strengthening international cooperation. As we are aware, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption were adopted in 2003, some 18 years ago. Since that time, the dangerous effects of corruption have been widely documented in various forms across the globe. It has been proven that corruption can have no term, undermining effects on the vibrancy of governance, the stability of our economies, and the premises of the rule of law. In my first State of the Nation address, which was delivered in 2018 at the beginning of my presidency, I declared that corruption under my administration will be unacceptable, and promised the Liberian people that those who prevail the public purse will be made to account. In order to actualize this promise, I reconstituted our National Anti-Corruption Commission in 2019 and charged that body to assess the framework of our fight against corruption and submit proposal to my office that can lead to a more effective national regime. The proposal was submitted in late 2020 and indicated that the legal framework to fight corruption in Liberia was inadequate, and if not reformed, our fight against corruption will be destined to fail. For example, the National Anti-Corruption Commission does not possess powers to exclusively prosecute acts of corruption and cannot independently compare and verify assets declared by public officials. In addition, we also observe that litigations of corruption cases were exceedingly time-consuming and difficult because of the lack of a dedicated venue for such trial. In response to these severe bounding constraints on the fight against corruption, I have recently submitted several legal instruments to the national legislature seeking to drastically improve the anti-corruption legal framework in Liberia. The passage into law of these proposals will make it easier to prevent acts of corruption, and if corruption is committed, easier to ensure accountability. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, the legal instruments submitted to the national legislature for its consideration includes bills to vest direct prosecution powers for acts of corruption solely in the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission, vest power to compare, verify, and recommend sanctions in regards to asset declarations by public officials solely in the Liberia Anti-Corruption Commission. Pass into law a Whistleblowers Act and establish a witness protection program and establish a fast-track court for the prosecution of cases of corruption. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, beyond the radical changes we seek in the legal framework to fight corruption, we have also taken very practical and divisive steps within the current framework when acts of corruption have been alleged. For example, in 2018, when the local Liberian media reported that 16 billion Liberian dollars of government funds have allegedly been stolen due to acts of corruption, we promptly invited the United States government to assist our government to investigate these allegations. We are proud to point out that the result of that investigation, which was undertaken by a well-respected international firm under a contract with the government of the United States, found that these allegations were false and that no acts of corruption had occurred. We appreciate the support provided by the U.S. government in this investigation. Sadly, good news travels less expediently than bad news. We also would like to point out that in the last year alone, we have been able to ensure both the restitutions of monies stolen from the public purse, as well as obtain convictions of former high-level government officials for acts of grand corruption while in office. Again, most of these positive strides do not get to make the international media. In the coming months, we will re-intensify our support to the major anti-graft institutions and engender increased coordinations and collaboration with these institutions, with continuing to further respect their independence and professionalism. We will also begin to aggressively court international support and collaborations now that we have set into motion the proper legal framework that can lead to a successful anti-corruption fight. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, the road ahead is still long and hard. Corruption is still a very powerful enemy in Liberia. But we assure you, Excellency, and distinguished ladies and gentlemen, that our commitment to ensure a corruption-free Liberia is as unwavering now as it was in 2018, when we first assumed the leadership of our country. I thank you.
I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Liberia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mauritius to introduce an address by the head of government.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues, I have the distinct honor to introduce a pre-recorded statement by Honorable Praveen Kumar Jagannath, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius.
Mr. President, Excellencies, corruption is a global problem which knows no boundaries. The tentacles of corruption have corrosive effects worldwide and have huge societal costs. It undermines trust in governments and is a threat to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Just like our battle against the COVID-19 pandemic, which can only be won through an effective and reinforced multilateralism, the fight against corruption requires an equally powerful and coordinated response. This special session of the General Assembly is, therefore, very timely. Pernicious and corrupt practices occur both in developed and developing countries. However, the economic loss, as well as the burden of blame, is always higher on the poorer countries. Reforms are therefore critically needed at the multilateral level to ensure remedies for public harm caused by transnational corruption. Cross-cutting issues linked to corruption, such as illicit financial flows and organized crime, have to be addressed in a comprehensive and coordinated manner. The return of stolen assets has to be part and parcel of this strategy. We welcome the political declaration adopted earlier. The declaration represents a forceful commitment by states to take effective measures to prevent and combat corruption. Mauritius remains resolute in its commitment to do so and to fight corruption in all its forms at all levels. We are determined to root out corruption through innovative means and collective efforts. We have already taken a number of well-targeted actions in this regard. Our public services are undergoing fundamental digital transformation. E-licensing and e-procurement have been introduced to reduce the risks of corruption and boost investment. Our anti-corruption agency, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, set up in 2002, has been promoting international and regional collaboration with anti-corruption agencies in the region and worldwide, and will collaborate closely with a global operational network of anti-corruption law enforcement agencies, which will soon be launched. Mr. President, Mauritius has completed both the first and second cycles of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption review mechanism and has been found to be most compliant with its provisions. Nevertheless, we are taking several new measures aimed at further strengthening our legal framework, such as a declaration of assets regime governing declaration of assets by all senior public officials, the setting up of a financial crimes division within both the Intermediate and the Supreme Court, and headed by specialized magistrates and judges to ensure expeditious prosecution of crimes of financial corruption and money laundering, and amendments to the Prevention of Corruption Act of 2002 to cover corruption offenses by any legal person, irrespective of whether it is a company, foundation, or other such recognized entities, and to increase the penalties linked to these crimes. Mauritius recognizes the contribution of the civil society, non-governmental organizations, and the private sector in the fight against corruption, and will further accentuate their participation as appropriate. Mauritius is also considering to empower our Financial Crime Commission to deal with fraud offenses, bribery of foreign public officials, financing of drug dealings, and ancillary offenses linked to financial crimes. Mr. President, Mauritius has come a long way from an economy based on monocrop agriculture to a resilient upper-income country with a vibrant financial and offshore center. The eradication of corrupt practices is, therefore, not only desirable, but is absolutely vital. Mauritius looks forward to collaborating closely with the international community in this struggle. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Republic of Mauritius for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia to introduce an address by the head of government.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by the Prime Minister of the Republic of Serbia, Her Excellency Ms. Ana Brnabić, on the occasion of the 32nd special session of the General Assembly.
Hello, everyone. Dear Mr. President, distinguished dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends. First of all, I would like to wish you the best regards from Belgrade and from the government of Serbia. It is my great honor and privilege to address to you on such an important topic such as fight against corruption. Corruption is a global challenge, something that all of us throughout the world, in all of the countries in the world, are faced with, something that all of us are committed to fighting. And it is also an issue which is a major roadblock to sustainable progress. Here in Serbia, we are committed to fighting corruption on all levels and in all fields. This is something that entire society needs to be focused on, and not just political elites. This is something that, in addition to both national and local governments, this issue needs to be addressed by civil society organizations, media, judiciary, independent institutions, and citizens at large. This is the fight that all of us win as a society, or none of us can win. Serbia fights corruption both strategically in the long term and also tactically in the short term. I would start by saying what we do tactically in the short term that makes a difference on a daily basis. That's e-government. So making all of our services, both to businesses and to our citizens, electronic. E-government has been one of the foundation stones of our reforms since 2016. By making all of the services electronically, you do not just increase efficiency of the government or increase transparency of the government. You do not just fight corruption, you basically effectively stop corruption. And the two best examples of how to do that and how this affects corruption is basically through e-permitting, electronic permitting processes, and e-procurement, electronic procurement. By making permitting processes and procurement completely electronic, you make it completely transparent, and you cut basically the physical space for corruption. We saw it in Serbia in the example of construction permitting process, where, whereas before we made this process electronic, Serbia was next to last in the World Bank's doing business list. And once we made it electronically, we made it so transparent and so efficient, we cut the space for corruption that today, just because it's e-permitting, Serbia is currently one of the top 10 countries in the world in construction permitting. Strategically, we fight corruption by strengthening the rule of law, building independent institutions, increasing the capacities of civil servants, but also by promoting freedom of media and legislative framework to fight corruption. Again, this is something that all of us need to do. So the involvement of each and every part of the society is equally important. I would like to finally thank all of our partners from the European Union, United Nations, obviously, organizations such as Council of Europe, OSCE, and others in supporting us to achieve progress and achieve results in this complex area. This really is not just about improving the transparency of the government. It's not just about enabling business environment. It is essentially about the quality of life and sustainable progress of all of our countries. I thank you very much, and I look forward to continuing our joint work on this issue.
I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the Republic of Serbia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of North Macedonia to introduce a pre-recorded statement by the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement by His Excellency Mr. Ljupcho Nikolovsky, Deputy Prime Minister of North Macedonia, in charge of fighting against corruption and crime. I thank you.
Dear President of the General Assembly, respected heads of delegations, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great honor and pleasure to address this General Assembly special session against corruption. My country, the Republic of North Macedonia, is a full member of the United Nations since 1993, during which time actively participates and strongly supports the policies of this important international organization and the founding pillars on which it is based: peace and security, human rights, rule of law, and development. In 2007, we ratified the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and its provisions became an integral part of the legal system of North Macedonia. The Convention sends a clear message of the entire international community for a non-compromise fight against corruption. This phenomenon and this issue is a transnational problem which requires joint action and cooperation of all countries. North Macedonia has proved its strong commitment to fight against corruption by establishing a new position in the new government as a deputy prime minister in charge fighting corruption and organized crime, sustainable development, and human resources. The fight against corruption is a key priority in our government program and in the government framework named as Action 21. And it is the result of our strong commitment to the introduction of a system that delivers justice, rule of law, and proper legal order. For the first time, also we have adopted already an anti-corruption plan consisting of 18 measures and politics for crucial reforms and transformation of our society. This plan is based also on the several pillars as a digital transformation, new law and mechanisms for checking the origin of property and the capital, confiscation of illegally acquired property, transparency, raising citizen awareness of reporting the corruption, high level of integrity, and ethical standards for public office holders. Our political will and efforts to prevent corruption is very clear and strong through the implementation of the United Nations Convention, as well as through the government's anti-corruption plan. We are creating a society in which there is no place for corruption, a society based on the rule of law and protection of the human rights. And this is our investment in the future, for a better life and for a state with strong and professional institutions. Corruption and crime do not recognize boundaries. We must be united in our commitment to the United Nations General Assembly, which is being transmitted around the world. This is a joint venture with which we will build a better world for all of us.
I wish to thank the Deputy Prime Minister of the Republic of North Macedonia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Latvia to introduce a pre-recorded statement by the Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor to present the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Justice of the Republic of Latvia, Mr. Jānis Bordāns, for a pre-recorded video statement. Thank you.
Mr. President, Excellencies, and distinguished delegates, it is my pleasure to address the United Nations on the occasion of the special session on challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption and to strengthen international cooperation. Latvia is strongly committed to prevent and fight both domestic and international corruption in all its forms and shapes. We acknowledge that only through strong international cooperation based on effective and binding legal frameworks such as the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and other instruments, fight against corruption can succeed. In our globally interconnected world, a corruption crime in one state can have a serious impact on other states as well as the global environment. It is the responsibility of states to coordinate and cooperate on all possible levels. To eliminate even the slightest possibility of corruption taking place, it is important to ensure exchange of important information, share the experience and provide assistance in training. Since the entry into force of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, Latvia has significantly stepped up its efforts in preventing and combating corruption. Latvia is currently undergoing the second review cycle of the Convention and urges other countries to step up their cooperation with the implementation review mechanism. Latvia is also a member of other international anti-corruption instruments, such as Council of Europe's GRECO, OECD, Moneyval. The Cooperation, Prevention and Combating Bureau of Latvia, an independent specialized anti-corruption authority established 18 years ago, has been continuously increasing its knowledge and capacity to investigate corruption crimes. Continuous education and training of the society, public and private sectors has been set as one of the basic principles in reducing public tolerance towards corruption and promoting public involvement in the policy-making process. The Corruption Prevention and Combating Bureau has also prioritized the investigation of international corruption cases. Previous cooperation with other states in investigation, exchanges of information, and experience and assistance in criminal proceeding has been very important to successfully investigate and bring to justice the perpetrators. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, during this high-level session, Latvia gladly shares its experience on enhancing public integrity. Together with Lithuania, Poland, and UNODC, we are holding a side event on innovative solutions that states can use to combat corruption. Based on our regional practices, Latvia will share knowledge on international control system for public institutions. Poland will share its expertise on conducting e-learning courses for public officials, and Lithuania will share latest developments on the recently launched Integrity Academy. Latvia is convinced that democracy, good governance, and the rule of law are important factors to preventing conflict and sustaining peace and development. As a candidate to the United Nations Security Council in 2025, Latvia will continue promoting these values and is committed to strengthen multilateral cooperation. I thank you for your attention.
I wish to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Justice of Latvia for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium to introduce a pre-recorded statement by the Deputy Prime Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai l'honneur d'annoncer l'intervention de Son Excellence Madame Sophie Wilmès, vice-première ministre et ministre des Affaires étrangères, des Affaires européennes et du Commerce extérieur du Royaume de Belgique.
Mesdames et Messieurs, la Belgique se réjouit d'être présente parmi vous en tant qu'État partie à la Convention des Nations Unies contre la corruption depuis 2008, réaffirmant ainsi son engagement à l'échelle mondiale contre les pratiques qui constituent une grave menace pour le fonctionnement des États et sapent l'atteinte par tous des objectifs de développement durable. La Belgique s'est engagée de longue date à défendre les valeurs communes à tous les États membres de l'Union européenne, valeurs parmi lesquelles le respect de l'État de droit constitue une priorité absolue. Le mécanisme européen de l'État de droit repose ainsi sur 4 piliers fondamentaux: le système de justice, le cadre de lutte contre la corruption, le pluralisme des médias et les autres pouvoirs et contre-pouvoirs institutionnels. Les mécanismes de suivi de la lutte contre la corruption sont multiples. Rappelons que notre pays est membre du GRECO depuis sa création en 1999 et est aussi membre du groupe de travail sur la corruption transnationale de l'OCDE depuis sa création en 1999. Ces mécanismes d'évaluation internationale nous engagent à correctement mettre en œuvre les conventions et à réajuster régulièrement notre cadre légal. Aujourd'hui, la lutte contre la corruption se concentre sur les activités répréhensibles des entreprises, des fonctionnaires, des individus. Laissez-moi souligner l'importance d'une approche préventive globale de la corruption. Tout changement passe d'abord par l'éducation. Il est de la plus haute importance d'y insuffler un sens de l'éthique et de l'intégrité. Nous sommes tous conscients que la lutte contre la corruption et la lutte contre l'impunité requièrent des efforts constants et une vigilance accrue de toutes les parties de la société, gouvernement, secteur privé, société civile, citoyens aussi. Monsieur le Président, la corruption est un crime transnational qui rend les enquêtes financières complexes et longues. La Belgique plaide pour accroître les synergies et pour un échange d'informations sécurisé entre les différentes agences chargées de la détection, de la poursuite et de la répression des faits de corruption. La coopération et la coordination avec les services de police et les magistrats des autres pays au travers d'Europol ou Eurojust facilite et accélère la coopération internationale. À cet égard, la Belgique se réjouit du lancement officiel lors de cette session spéciale de l'Assemblée générale du premier réseau global d'échange opérationnel d'informations, le GLOBE. La corruption ne peut être séparée d'un contexte économique, social, politique. Sur le plan pénal, elle est fréquemment liée à la criminalité organisée et au blanchiment d'argent. Elle entraîne un enrichissement économique illicite. Elle forme un terreau fertile pour d'autres crimes, parfois odieux, comme le trafic des êtres humains, trafic que la Belgique continuera à combattre sur le plan international. Je souhaite maintenant mettre l'accent sur plusieurs types de criminalité transnationale facilitée par la corruption. Tout d'abord, dans le contexte de la pandémie, il est nécessaire que les États prennent des mesures pour identifier et réduire les risques de corruption pouvant compromettre l'accès de la population à des vaccins anti-Covid-19 sûrs et efficaces. Mon pays a récemment présenté une résolution pour prévenir et combattre la fabrication et le trafic de produits médicaux falsifiés en tant que forme de criminalité transnationale organisée. Ensuite, l'atteinte des objectifs de développement durable 13, climat, et 15, biodiversité, peut elle aussi être compromise par des faits de corruption. C'est pour cette raison que mon pays a contribué à concurrence de plus de 3 millions d'euros pour des programmes de l'ONUDC visant à prévenir et combattre la corruption liée à la criminalité environnementale. La détection de la corruption à l'étranger constitue également un point d'attention de la Belgique. Un protocole d'accord conclu en 2016 entre les ministres belges de la Justice, des Affaires étrangères et les autorités judiciaires facilite le flux d'informations des postes diplomatiques à l'étranger vers les autorités judiciaires compétentes dans le cadre d'enquêtes et de poursuites de délits de corruption transnationale. Ce protocole d'accord permet la prévention. Nos postes diplomatiques sont mis en mesure de fournir, sur demande ou de manière proactive, les directives et informations opérationnelles utiles aux Belges. Enfin, depuis plusieurs années, la corruption dans le sport est mise en lumière comme jamais auparavant. Il est essentiel de faire en sorte que tous les acteurs du domaine sportif travaillent de concert, partagent des informations et poursuivent l'objectif d'équité dans le sport. Ainsi, la Belgique a mis en place au sein de la police judiciaire fédérale un Sport Fraud Team qui se situe dans la plateforme nationale pour la lutte contre la fraude sportive. Je suis convaincue que la déclaration politique qui a été négociée et adoptée lors de cette Assemblée générale extraordinaire pose les fondations nécessaires pour continuer à poursuivre sans relâche cette lutte contre la corruption et le recouvrement des flux illicites. Parce que seule la défense de nos valeurs communes, fondée sur les droits humains, la démocratie, l'état de droit, constituera le socle nécessaire à l'émergence de sociétés résilientes. La Belgique est tout à fait disposée à partager ses connaissances, son expérience à cet égard, à jouer un rôle moteur aussi dans l'application des traités actuels et à participer à de nouvelles initiatives. Je vous remercie.
I wish to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs of Belgium for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China to introduce a pre-recorded statement by the member of the Standing Committee of the CPC, Central Committee, Political Bureau, and Secretary of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection of the CPC.
谢谢主席先生。主席先生，下面请聆听中共中央政治局常委、中央纪委书记赵乐际阁下讲话。
主席先生，各位同事、女士们、先生们、朋友们，今天联合国首次聚焦反腐败问题，召开特别联大。这是国际反腐败史上的重要里程碑。 中国是第一个在联合国宪章上签字的国家，也是最早签署和批准联合国反腐败公约的国家之一。我们高度赞赏联合国在预防和惩治腐败中所做的努力和贡献，坚定支持公约在全球反腐败治理中发挥主其道作用。欢迎特别联大通过政治宣言，愿与各方一道推进国际反腐败事业迈上新征程。女士们、先生们，中国共产党和中国政府旗帜鲜明反对腐败，不断完善中国特色社会主义监督制度，深入探索党长期执政条件下实现自我净化的有效路径，得到了中国人民的衷心拥护和广泛支持，为国家长治久安和可持续发展提供了坚强保障。一是加强集中统一领导，以顽强意志品质同腐败作斗争。领导人的政治决心和政治勇气对于推进反腐败工作尤为重要。习近平主席高度重视反腐败工作，中共中央对反腐败工作实行集中统一领导，以刮骨疗毒的决心和意志，同一切形式的腐败作斗争，成为打击腐败最有力的政治引领和保障。二是有腐必反，有贪必肃，以零容忍态度惩治腐败。中共中央把全面从严治党纳入战略布局，坚持无禁区、全覆盖、零容忍，打虎、拍蝇、猎狐多管齐下，推动反腐败斗争取得压倒性胜利，并全面巩固。三是坚持以人民为中心，坚决整治群众身边腐败和不正之风，以强有力的监督检查，保障疫情防控取得重大战略成果，保障脱贫攻坚取得全面胜利，人民群众获得感、幸福感、安全感不断增强。中国国家统计局调查显示，人民群众对反腐败工作满意率为95.8%。四是坚持法治思维和法治方式，一体推进，不敢腐、不能腐、不想腐，深化纪检监察体制改革，设立各级监察委员会，建立起集中统一、全面覆盖、权威高效的监督体系，坚持系统施治、标本监制，把依法惩治、制度约束、教育引导结合起来，提升腐败治理效能。女士们、先生们，中国是全球反腐败治理的积极参与者和贡献者。我们全面履行公约义务，推动亚太经合组织通过《北京反腐败宣言》，20国集团通过《反腐败追逃追赃高级原则》，发起廉洁丝绸之路北京倡议，深入推进“一带一路”廉洁建设，加强国际追逃追赃，与许多国家建立了良好合作关系。 当前百年变局和世纪疫情交织叠加，各国利益更是休戚与共，更加需要携手打击腐败。为此，我愿就反腐败国际合作提出以下主张：第一，坚持公平正义，惩恶扬善。国际社会要广泛凝聚政治共识，对腐败问题秉持零容忍态度，打造零漏洞制度，开展零障碍合作，积极推进追逃追赃和跨国商业贿赂治理等国际合作，反对以任何借口为腐败分子和腐败资产提供避风港。第二，坚持尊重差异，平等互鉴，尊重各国主权、政治制度和法律体系，尊重各国自主选择反腐败道路的权利，推动建立平等相待、尊重差异、交流互鉴、共同进步的反腐败国际合作伙伴关系，反对以反腐败为由滥用长臂管辖，甚至干涉他国内政。第三，坚持合作共赢、共商共建，维护多边主义，在协商一致基础上完善全球反腐败治理规则体系，按照联合国宪章宗旨和原则办事，在公约框架下开展反腐败合作。中方欢迎公约秘书处牵头建立全球反腐败执法合作网络，期待深化务实合作。第四，坚持信守承诺，行动优先。公约缔约方应信守合作打击腐败的庄严承诺，全面履行国际义务，言必行，行必果，不能和则用，不和则弃。广泛缔结引渡刑事司法协助条约，消除追逃追赃各种障碍，让腐败分子无所遁形。近年来，中国为60多个发展中国家反腐败机构和有关国际组织提供了支持。我们将继续为联合国毒罪办、国际反腐败学院等机构提供力所能及的资助，并为发展中国家反腐败能力建设做出贡献。女士们、先生们，腐败是人类的共同敌人，反腐败是各国的正义事业。让我们携起手来，秉持人类命运共同体理念，共建清正廉洁的地球家园。
I wish to thank the member of the Standing Committee of the CPC, Central Committee Political Bureau, and Secretary of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection of the CPC for the statement just made. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union to introduce a pre-recorded statement by the Minister.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to introduce the pre-recorded statement of Mrs. Ylva Johansson, European Commissioner for Home Affairs, who will speak on behalf of the European Union.
Mr. President of the United Nations General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, corruption endangers the stability and security of our societies. undermines public trust and institutions, facilitates organized crime, and threatens sustainable development. Corruption thrives in times of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic created opportunities for corruption to grow. Strong governance and international cooperation to fight corruption are now more important than ever. On behalf of the European Union, I thank you for organizing this timely special session on measures to prevent and combat corruption. The European Union supports the political declaration to renew our global commitments and to strengthen international cooperation in the fight against corruption. Combating corruption is high on the EU agenda. Fighting corruption is central to European economic governance. Our legislation protects the European Union's financial interest against fraud and corruption. The independent European Public Prosecutor's Office, tasked to fight crimes against the EU budget, is starting to work. The EU funds that support recovery from the pandemic have built-in mechanisms to prevent any kind of fraud, corruption, and conflict of interest. To fight corruption, we need to uphold the rule of law. This requires robust institutions, independent and impartial legal system, a pluralistic media, strong investigative journalism, an engaged society. The European Union has established a new rule of law mechanism to foster a rule of law culture across the European Union. With the EU Rule of Law report published last year for the first time, and with the second report due for adoption in July. To fight corruption, we need effective crime prevention and criminal justice response. This means boosting the capacity for successful investigations, prosecutions, and convictions against corruption and corruption-related offences. This requires training and sufficient resources for specialized anti-corruption authorities and criminal justice institutions. Asset recovery is an important element of crime prevention and criminal justice in cases involving corruption. Confiscating criminal assets is also a central element of the recently adopted EU strategy to tackle organized crime. Recovering assets and confiscating proceeds of crime should be accompanied by appropriate measures to promote transparency and accountability in the management of public finances, in order to benefit those harmed by corruption within the framework of UN Convention Against Corruption and the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. The European Union particularly supports a strong role of civil society, non-governmental organizations, academia, and media. They have an important role in preventing and fighting corruption. The EU supports a safe and enabling environment for whistleblowers in exposing, reporting, and fighting corruption, and condemns all attacks on those who work to expose corruption. We can only fight corruption together by strengthening our international cooperation. The EU calls on all UN member states to make the best possible use of all global and regional instruments at your disposal. In particular, the relevant conventions of the United Nations, the Council of Europe, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The EU, as party to the UN Convention Against Corruption, will fully participate in the review mechanism. I look forward to the discussions at the special session and congratulate you on behalf of the European Union on the adoption of the political declaration. Thank you.
I wish to thank the Commissioner for Home Affairs of the European Union for the statement just made. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Christine Lambrecht, Federal Minister of Justice and Consumer Protection of Germany.
Herr Präsident, Exzellenzen, meine Damen und Herren! Im Namen der Bundesrepublik Deutschland möchte ich zunächst ein Wort des Dankes aussprechen. Wir gehen heute einen wichtigen Schritt bei der internationalen Bekämpfung der Korruption. Und ich danke allen, die dies ermöglicht haben, besonders den Co-Facilitators der Abschlusserklärung, ferner dem Büro der Vereinten Nationen für Drogen- und Verbrechensbekämpfung. Deutschland schließt sich dem Statement an, das für die Europäische Union abgegeben wurde. Ich möchte 3 Punkte näher ausführen, die aus deutscher Sicht besonders wichtig sind. Erstens, wir sind überzeugt, die Staatengemeinschaft wird im Kampf gegen Korruption nur Erfolg haben, wenn sie einige zentrale Grundsätze beherzigt. Dazu zählen insbesondere die folgenden. Korruption muss vorgebeugt werden durch Transparenz und Integrität in Staat und Wirtschaft. Und das bedeutet auch, Staaten müssen ihre Bediensteten nach fairen und objektiven Kriterien auswählen. Wo es zu Korruption kommt, muss diese aufgedeckt, staatlich verfolgt und bestraft werden. Und das gilt auch für die Bestechung von ausländischen Amtsträgern. Außerdem muss Geldwäsche effektiv bekämpft werden und Vermögenswerte, die durch Korruption erlangt wurden, müssen an ihre rechtmäßigen Eigentümer zurückgegeben werden. Und schließlich, auch bei der Bekämpfung von Korruption müssen Menschenrechte strikt beachtet werden. In der Abschlusserklärung kommt auch der letztgenannte Grundsatz klar zum Ausdruck, und das begrüßen wir sehr. Ein zweiter wichtiger Punkt. Auf die Zivilgesellschaft kommt es an. Die freie Presse, NGOs und andere Akteure. Sie alle leisten einen großen Beitrag zur Bekämpfung von Korruption durch mutige Recherche, durch schonungslose Aufklärung. Die Staatengemeinschaft muss dafür sorgen, dass die zivilgesellschaftlichen Akteure die Freiheit und den Schutz genießen, die sie für diese wichtige Arbeit benötigen. Wir begrüßen es, dass die Abschlusserklärung diese wichtige Rolle der Zivilgesellschaft ausdrücklich nennt. Und drittens, auch die bisher vernachlässigten Dimensionen von Korruption müssen wir in den Blick nehmen. Und das gilt insbesondere für die Geschlechterdimension. Schul- und Gesundheitswesen sind oft stark von Korruption betroffen. Und es sind vor allem Frauen, die darunter leiden, denn häufig sind sie es, die sich um die Ausbildung der Kinder, um die Gesundheit der Familien kümmern. Diese ungleiche Betroffenheit muss endlich angegangen werden durch eine aktive Gleichstellungspolitik. Und wir begrüßen es deshalb, dass die Abschlusserklärung die Geschlechterdimension der Korruption ausdrücklich adressiert. Verschärfte Aufmerksamkeit verdient auch das Problem der Korruption in Krisenzeiten. Staaten müssen auf Katastrophen schnell und flexibel reagieren, daran gibt es keinen Zweifel. Und wo flexibel agiert wird, da wächst allerdings die Gefahr von Korruption. Und das hat die Covid-19-Pandemie deutlich gezeigt. Und dagegen müssen wir bessere Vorkehrungen treffen. Und es ist positiv, dass die Abschlusserklärung auch diese Herausforderung benennt. Meine Damen und Herren, der Kampf gegen Korruption ist unsere gemeinsame Verantwortung. Und nur wenn wir entschlossen gegen Korruption vorgehen, können wir die Ziele der Agenda 2030 erreichen, die 17 Ziele für nachhaltige Entwicklung. Nur wenn wir geschlossen gegen Korruption vorgehen, können wir die Ziele erreichen, zu denen sich die Vereinten Nationen seit 1948 bekennen. Freiheit, Gerechtigkeit und Frieden in der Welt. Deutschland ist sich dieser Verantwortung bewusst. Wir werden uns weiterhin stark machen für eine Welt ohne Korruption, national wie international. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit.
I thank the Federal Minister of Justice and Consumer Protection of Germany for her statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Etilda Jonas, Minister of Justice of Albania.
Your Excellency, Mr. President at the plenary, honorable delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is an immense privilege as Minister of Justice of Albania to address today the special session of the General Assembly on the challenges and measures to prevent and combat corruption. This meeting serves as a reminder to step up our efforts in preventing and fighting corruption, but most importantly, to renew our engagement at the national and international level to find new ways and tools to fight corruption. Corruption certainly undermines the principles of democracy and the rule of law. It touches on the essence of the trust that the citizens grant to the government to fulfill its responsibilities. The progress and prosperity of a country at large are deeply affected by the impediments caused by corruptive practices at all levels of the government. Albania has suffered a great deal from corruption over decades, challenging our democratization process, the growth of our economy, the quality of public services, and our whole society. Therefore, the Albanian government has put the fight against corruption at the very top of its agenda, undertaking concrete steps through cross-sectoral policies and designing a multi-layer anti-corruption mechanism. We are determined to eradicate corruption and strengthen rule of law and democracy in our country, being aware that only a very well-tailored and multi-layered mechanism would eradicate corruption. It has been the strong will and determination of the Albanian government to tackle corruption through a systematic and holistic approach, putting as such the anti-corruption efforts at the very top of our agenda. In this context, we saw the persistent need that Albania had to initiate the cleaning of the Palace of Justice in order to guarantee the effectiveness of its further efforts against corruption in all areas of government action. Albania has undertaken in the last 5 years the most deep-cutting reform of the justice system. The aim of such reform was to restore the trust of citizens in a judicial system based on integrity, transparency, professionalism, efficiency, and above all, the independence. This reform has marked a turning point in terms of intensifying efforts in the fight against corruption and organized crime. In order to tackle the endemic corruption in the judiciary, a one-of-its-kind system of vetting of judges was established. Moreover, a fully fledged institutional architecture in the fight against corruption and organized crime has become operational, including a special prosecution for the fight against corruption and organized crime, special courts, as well as the National Bureau of Investigation. Such institutional architecture enables to channel the punitive efforts by expelling the corrupt judges and prosecutors from the system and establishing a track record of investigation and punishment of their corruptive practices. Now that the justice reform is in advanced stage of its implementation, we are proud to say that the results have been very rewarding and encouraging. For the first time, high-profile officials have been dismissed from office, prosecuted and punished for corruption. Their assets are being seized and criminal cases are being reopened. The implementation of the justice system in Albania has been a very challenging endeavor. Nevertheless, through the invaluable technical assistance support of our international partners, as EU and the USA, we rose to the challenge. The support of our international partners has been crucial in enabling us to stay firm and faithful to our vision, to establish a justice system that would put an end to the culture of impunity in Albania. It is this renewed justice system that will serve as the fundament of sustainable and strong institutions. The Albanian government, through full digitalization of public services and by implementing accessible denunciation mechanisms, have built lasting mechanisms that offer the citizens the anti-corruption guardian. Throughout the course of implementation of our anti-corruption agenda, we have established meaningful exchange with the civil society and businesses in order to understand the shapes and forms of corruption and fine-tune our anti-corruption policies accordingly. We have improved substantially our anti-corruption practices by taking very seriously the recommendations of Greco and Manival and have signed significant progress in our common efforts against corruption. Esteemed participants and colleagues, as much as we strive to fight corruption within our domestic borders, this phenomena has become increasingly more complex and international. We can no longer stand behind the traditional walls of state border to identify and fight illicit financial flows and many other types of organized crime that are deeply intertwined with corruption practices. I am here today to express the full political will of Albanian government to take all concrete steps in this joint battle against corruption. I strongly believe that this special session of the General Assembly will serve for all us as an opportunity to strengthen the implementation of United Nations Convention Against Corruption as a common ground to multiply and intensify our mutual efforts in fighting corruption for the purpose of strengthening the rule of law, ensuring faster progress for our countries, and, most important, enabling a world of opportunities for our citizens. Thank you very much.
I thank the Minister of Justice of Albania for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico to introduce a pre-recorded statement by the Minister.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Señor presidente, el Gobierno de México da la bienvenida a la celebración de esta sesión extraordinaria de la Asamblea General sobre Corrupción 2021 y la adopción de su declaración política. Señor presidente, tengo el honor de presentar la intervención pregrabada de la Secretaría de la Función Pública, maestra Irmeréndira Sandoval. Muchas gracias.
Estimados jefes de Estado y de Gobierno, representantes de los países miembros de las Naciones Unidas, es para mí un honor representar a mi país en esta histórica sesión especial de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas en la lucha contra la corrupción. Ese mal que afecta a nuestros países, nos arrebata oportunidades de desarrollo, genera pobreza, fomenta desigualdad y sobre todo erosiona la confianza en la democracia y en nuestras instituciones. En el Gobierno de México hemos construido una nueva conceptualización de este flagelo. La corrupción no puede seguir siendo vista como un asunto cultural o estrictamente burocrático o administrativo. Para nosotros, la corrupción es un fenómeno político que se alimenta del abuso de poder, de la impunidad y de la falta de voz ciudadana en los asuntos públicos. El Gobierno de México, liderado por el presidente López Obrador, sostiene que la única manera de lograr la transformación política es erradicando la corrupción. Por ello, implementamos proyectos transformadores para impulsar la ciudadanización del combate a la misma. Democratizamos nuestras tecnologías, ofrecimos transparencia total de las declaraciones patrimoniales, eliminamos el fuero para el presidente de la República, impulsamos licitaciones consolidadas en línea y con control social, aprobamos la Ley Federal de Austeridad Republicana, relanzamos el Servicio Civil de Carrera con perspectiva de género, impulsamos el programa de protección y auspicio de alertadores internos de la corrupción, los whistleblowers mexicanos. Eliminamos las partidas presupuestales secretas y los fondos y los fideicomisos sin rendición de cuentas. Implementamos el padrón de integridad empresarial y hemos castigado los conflictos de interés e inhabilitado a licitantes y contratistas que abusan del interés público. En estos escasos 2 años de un gobierno distinto, emanado de una insurgencia democrática sin parangón en nuestra historia contemporánea, México está dando frutos. De acuerdo con estudios internacionales, en 2019, México dio un salto histórico en la confianza ciudadana, al pasar de 24 a 61% en la proporción de mexicanos que valora positivamente nuestras estrategias de combate a la corrupción. México también logró reducir sus indicadores de corrupción en los servicios y trámites administrativos, ya que pasamos de un 51% de ciudadanos que experimentaron sobornos en 2017 a un 34% en 2019. Y en estos 2 primeros años de nuestro gobierno, México ha avanzado 14 posiciones en la mejora del índice global de percepción de la corrupción de Transparencia Internacional, lo que contrasta con la franca caída de 6 puntos y 33 lugares registrados en ese mismo indicador entre 2012 y 2018. Sin embargo, en México no echamos campanas al vuelo. Reconocemos que la lucha contra la corrupción tiene que combatirse en el ámbito internacional y estamos sometiéndonos a las mejores prácticas internacionales. Hemos promovido el intercambio de experiencias en todos los foros globales en la materia y asimismo somos partícipes de los distintos mecanismos de seguimiento e implementación de las principales convenciones internacionales. Por ello, hoy celebramos la adopción en esta sesión especial de la Declaración en materia de combate a la corrupción, pues para México es el interés público el que debe regir sobre absolutamente cualquier interés privado, por más legítimo que éste sea. Pueden contar con el compromiso de México. Redoblaremos esfuerzos para prevenir y castigar la corrupción, particularmente en aquellas áreas de mayor riesgo como serían las contrataciones en materia de salud ante la emergencia del COVID-19. Aquí destaco que también en nuestro país hemos dado un ejercicio fiscalizador muy cercano a los procesos de contratación pública para insumos médicos y de adquisiciones de las vacunas. Hemos asegurado así una transparencia democrática expansiva y un ejercicio honesto de nuestros recursos públicos. Refrendo ante esta Asamblea General que en México construimos una nueva ética de trabajo para conseguir entre todos un mundo libre de corrupción, con mayor desarrollo sostenible y sustentable y con justicia social, ese mundo que todos nos merecemos. Muchas gracias.
Gobierno de México.
Thank the Minister of Public Administration of Mexico for the statement just made. We have heard the last speaker for this meeting. We shall hear the remaining speakers this afternoon at 3 p.m. in this hall. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of Agenda Item 7. The General Assembly will now consider Sub-Item B of Agenda Item 3, entitled Report of the Credentials Committee to consider the credentials of representatives to the 32nd Special Session. As proposed in my letter dated 3rd of May 2021, in light of the challenges posed by COVID-19 and similar to the 31st Special Session in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the concurrence of the members of the Credentials Committee having been obtained, it would be advisable that the Assembly decide on an exceptional basis to accept the credentials approved for the 75th regular session for purposes of the 32nd special session. In this regard, I recall that the Credentials Committee of the 75th regular session accepted the credentials of representatives of all member states at its meeting held on 23rd of November 2020, and the General Assembly approved the report of the Credentials Committee by its Resolution 75/19, adopted on 1st of December 2020. This would be without prejudice to the right of member states to submit separate credentials with respect to the 32nd special session and would not set a precedent for future sessions. If I hear no objection, may I take it that it is the wish of the Assembly to accept the credentials approved for the 75th regular session for purposes of the special session on an exceptional basis and without setting a precedent. It is so decided. May I take it that it is the wish of the General Assembly to conclude its consideration of sub-item B of Agenda Item 3 and of Agenda Item 3 as a whole? It is so decided. Before adjourning, may I kindly request delegates to leave the hall while maintaining physical distancing. I thank you for your cooperation. The meeting is adjourned.